August 15, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months, but in a small prisoner of war camp outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the consequences of that war were still unfolding in unexpected ways. 47 German women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, sat in the mess hall, facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Captain Dorothy Richardson stood before them, holding official documents from the War Department, preparing to announce their repatriation to Germany. But none of them knew that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day everything changed. The women had arrived at Camp Riverside in February, captured during the final desperate months of Germany's collapse. They ranged in age from 18 to 35, radio operators, nurses, administrative clerks, and logistics coordinators who had believed they were serving their country's defense. Now they sat in metal folding chairs, wearing donated civilian clothes that replaced their tattered gray uniforms, their faces reflecting 6 months of transformation they were still trying to understand. Margaret Schroeder, known as Greta to everyone in the camp, sat in the front row. At 24 years old, she had been a supply coordinator in Berlin, responsible for distributing increasingly scarce resources to military units. Her hands, once soft from office work, now bore calluses from 6 months of kitchen duty and farm labor. She clutched a small notebook where she had been practicing her English, writing down new words and phrases that still felt foreign on her tongue. Beside her sat Anneliese Vogel, a 21-year-old former radio operator from Hamburg. Her blonde hair, which had been regulation short when she arrived, had grown past her shoulders. She wore a donated blue dress that someone's daughter had outgrown, and she twisted the fabric nervously between her fingers as Captain Richardson prepared to speak. Anneliese had written 17 letters to her family in Hamburg and received only 2 responses, the last one arriving 3 months ago, describing conditions she could barely comprehend. Wilhelmina Keller, called Mina by everyone who knew her, sat further back. At 28, she was one of the oldest prisoners and had become the unofficial translator for the group. Before the war, she had studied English literature at university in Cologne, a detail that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime entirely. She had spent 6 months bridging the gap between German prisoners and American guards, and in doing so, had witnessed things that contradicted everything she thought she knew about enemies and allies. Captain Richardson cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. Outside, a warm August breeze carried the smell of cut grass and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. Inside, 47 women held their breath, waiting to learn when they would be sent back to a Germany that no longer resembled the country they had left. What none of them knew was that in approximately 4 hours, a local restaurant owner named Giuseppe Romano would arrive at the camp gates carrying something that would change several of their lives forever. But first, they had to get through this meeting. February 9, 1945. Snow fell heavily across Pennsylvania as a military transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Riverside. Inside, huddled together for warmth, sat 23 German women who had been captured 3 weeks earlier in Belgium. They had spent the journey across the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, then another week being processed through Ellis Island before being transported to this rural facility that had been hastily converted to house female prisoners of war. Greta Schroeder pressed her face against the truck's canvas covering, trying to see where they were being taken. The landscape looked nothing like Germany. Everything seemed bigger somehow, the roads wider, the buildings more spread out. But what struck her most was how untouched everything appeared. No bomb craters, no burned-out buildings, no rubble-filled streets. The war had never touched this place. When the truck finally stopped and the women were ordered out, they stumbled into the snow with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Greta's stomach cramped with hunger. Their last meal had been thin soup and hard bread 18 hours ago. Before that, rations had been steadily decreasing for months. She had grown accustomed to the constant gnawing sensation, the lightheadedness that came with not having enough food. Anneliese climbed down from the truck behind her, nearly losing her balance. At 21, she should have been in her prime, but months of inadequate nutrition had left her thin and weak. Her radio operator's uniform hung loosely on her frame, and her face had the hollow-cheeked look that had become common among German military personnel in the final months of the war. Mina Keller was the last to exit, helping two younger women who were struggling with the cold and exhaustion. As the former translator, she had been given slightly better rations than the others, but even she had lost considerable weight. Her coat, which had fit properly 6 months ago, now seemed too large for her diminished frame. Captain Richardson, who had arrived at the camp only 2 days earlier to oversee the facility's conversion to house female prisoners, watched the women assemble in formation. She had been briefed on their condition, but was still shocked by what she saw. These were not the fearsome Nazi soldiers of propaganda posters. They were exhausted, hungry young women who looked like they might collapse at any moment. The camp's medical officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, stood beside the captain with growing concern. She had examined male German prisoners before, but something about seeing women in this condition affected her differently. These could have been her sisters, her friends, her students. The war had reduced them to shadows of what they should have been. Guard Sergeant Miguel Santos called out orders in English that none of the prisoners understood. Mina stepped forward hesitantly, her university English rusty but functional. "I can translate," she said quietly, her accent thick but her words clear enough. It was the first bridge built between captors and captives. The processing took 4 hours. Medical examinations, documentation, assignment of barracks, distribution of camp regulations printed in German that most of the women were too exhausted to read. By the time they were finally dismissed to their quarters, it was nearly midnight. The women collapsed onto the metal cots, most not even bothering to remove their boots. Sleep came quickly despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Greta woke to the sound of a bell ringing. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the barracks windows. For a moment she forgot where she was, then reality returned with crushing weight. She was a prisoner in America, thousands of miles from home, with no idea when or if she would ever see Berlin again. The other women stirred slowly, stiff from sleeping on the thin mattresses. A guard appeared at the door, a young woman in uniform who smiled apologetically. "Breakfast in 30 minutes, she said in English, then waited for Mina to translate. The word breakfast triggered something in Greta's stomach, a desperate hunger that had become her constant companion. She wondered what prisoners of war were fed in America, probably the same thin soup and stale bread they had been eating for months. 30 minutes later, the women filed into the mess hall and stopped. The smell hit them first. Bacon. Real bacon. The kind Greta had not smelled since before the war. Coffee, actual coffee, not the roasted grain substitute they had been drinking for years. Toast. Eggs. Her eyes widened as she saw American soldiers moving through a serving line, their trays piled with more food than she had seen in months. The prisoners were directed to a separate section, but when they reached the serving counter, the same abundance awaited them. 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with butter, a small bowl of oatmeal, a cup of coffee, and a glass of orange juice. Greta stared at her tray, certain there had been a mistake. This was more food than her family's weekly ration in Berlin had been in the final months before her capture. Annalisa stood frozen, her tray trembling in her hands. Tears began streaming down her face. Behind her, another woman started crying, then another. Within moments, half the prisoners were weeping at the sight of a simple American breakfast. Mina translated quietly for the confused guards. "They have not seen this much food in a very long time." Greta carried her tray to a table, but could not bring herself to eat. She kept thinking about her mother and sister in Berlin, about the neighbors who had been surviving on potato peels and hope. Greta stared at the eggs congealing on her plate, and her mind drifted back to Berlin in the winter of 1943. She remembered the morning her mother had divided a single potato among 4 people for breakfast, carefully cutting it so each slice was exactly the same size. Her younger sister Katrine, only 14 at the time, had cried not from hunger, but from shame, that she wanted more. That was when Greta had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing that military service would mean she would eat, and her family would have one less mouth to feed. The rations had been better at first. Real bread, sometimes meat, vegetables that actually had substance. But as the war dragged on and Allied bombing intensified, even military rations had dwindled. By the time of her capture, her daily allocation had been reduced to a piece of dark bread barely larger than her palm, a cup of weak soup, and occasionally a small piece of cheese or a withered potato. Annaliese's memories of Hamburg were similar, but somehow worse. She remembered the night her apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid, how she and her mother had spent 3 days in a shelter with no food at all. When they finally emerged, the Red Cross had distributed thin soup that tasted like hot water with a rumor of vegetables. People had fought over the distribution, desperate and animal-like in their hunger. She remembered reporting to her radio operator station and feeling faint during her shift, the room spinning because she had not eaten anything substantial in 2 days. Her commanding officer had noticed and shared half of his own ration with her, a gesture that had probably saved her from collapsing. He had been killed 2 weeks later when the communications building took a direct hit. She had survived only because she had been running an errand at the time. Mina's experience in Cologne had been different, but equally devastating. As a university-educated woman from a middle-class family, she had watched the slow erosion of civilization through the lens of food. First, restaurants closed. Then cafes stopped serving real coffee, bakeries ran out of white flour, then any flour. Markets that had once overflowed with produce stood empty except for the occasional delivery of turnips or beets. She remembered her father, a professor of literature, trading his beloved books for food on the black market. First editions of Goethe and Schiller exchanged for a loaf of bread or a few eggs. The shame in his eyes had been worse than the hunger. He had died during the winter of 1944, and Mina had always believed it was as much from heartbreak as from malnutrition. Now she sat in an American prison camp, staring at more food than her father had seen in the last year of his life. 3 weeks into their captivity, the camp administrators made a decision that would change everything. The prisoners needed work assignments, both to keep them occupied and to contribute to the camp's operations. Mina, with her English skills, was assigned to help in the kitchen under the supervision of Sergeant James Washington, a 42-year-old career soldier from Georgia who had been cooking for the Army for nearly 20 years. Mina approached the kitchen with trepidation that first morning. She expected to find carefully rationed supplies, portions measured out with precision, the kind of scarcity management she had witnessed in every German military facility. Instead, she walked into a storage room that made her stop breathing. Sacks of flour stacked to the ceiling, crates of potatoes, boxes of canned goods, containers of sugar, salt, cooking oil. Fresh vegetables delivered daily, meat in quantities she could not comprehend. Sergeant Washington noticed her staring. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his southern accent thick, but his tone kind. Mina struggled to find words in English. "This is all for the camp?" she finally managed. "How many soldiers here?" Washington chuckled. "About 200 personnel total, including you ladies. Why?" Mina did calculations in her head. In Berlin, these supplies would have fed 2,000 people for a month, maybe longer. Here, they would be consumed in weeks. She spent that first day in shocked silence, watching Washington and his staff prepare meals with a casual abundance that seemed impossible. They threw away potato peels thick enough to make soup. They used butter as if it were ordinary, not the precious commodity that Germans had been substituting with lard and margarine for years. When Washington cracked a dozen eggs to make scrambled eggs for the guards' breakfast, not measuring or conserving, just cooking, Mina had to excuse herself and step outside. The propaganda made sense now in a terrible way. She had been told that America was suffering, that their economy was collapsing, that their people were starving while their soldiers fought overseas. She had been told that Germany was winning because German efficiency would overcome American excess. But standing in that kitchen, she understood the truth. America was not suffering. America had so much food that they could feed their prisoners better than Germany had fed its own soldiers. That evening, Mina returned to the barracks and found Greta and Anneliese sitting together. She sat down beside them and spoke quietly in German. "I worked in the kitchen today." They looked at her expectantly. "We were lied to about everything," Mina said simply. "The food I saw today, the supplies in storage, it is more than some German cities had in the entire last year of the war." Greta's face went pale. "What are you saying?" Mina met her eyes. "I am saying that we were starving while fighting a country that has never known hunger. I am saying that our leaders sent us to fight an enemy they knew we could never defeat." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of understanding. Private Tommy DeLuca had been drafted into the Army 2 years earlier, fresh out of high school in Brooklyn. He had expected to see combat, to fight Germans in Europe or Japanese soldiers in the Pacific. Instead, he found himself stationed at a prisoner of war camp in Pennsylvania, guarding women who looked barely older than his younger sister. It was not the war he had imagined, but it was the war he got. He noticed Anneliese during the 3rd week. She sat apart from the others during recreation time, staring at nothing in particular, with an expression of profound sadness. Tommy recognized that look. His grandmother had worn the same expression after his grandfather died, a kind of grief that went beyond words. On impulse, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in wax paper. His grandmother had sent him biscotti in her last care package, traditional Italian cookies twice baked until they were hard and perfect for dipping in coffee. Tommy had been saving them, rationing them out to make them last. But looking at Anneliese's hollow face, he made a decision. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me, miss," he said. Anneliese looked up, her expression wary. Tommy held out the package. "Cookie," he said simply, making an eating gesture. "For you." Anneliese stared at the offering like it might be a trap. In her experience, guards did not give prisoners gifts. There was always a price, always an expectation. But Tommy just smiled and set the package on the bench beside her. "My nonna made them. Biscotti. Very good." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her alone with the unexpected gift. Anneliese waited until he was gone before carefully unwrapping the wax paper. Inside were 6 golden brown cookies, each one studded with almonds. She picked one up and sniffed it cautiously. It smelled like vanilla and butter and something else she could not identify. She took a small bite, and her eyes closed involuntarily. The cookie was crunchy and slightly sweet, with a richness that came from real butter and eggs. She had not tasted anything like it in years. She ate one cookie slowly, making it last as long as possible. Then she carefully rewrapped the rest and took them back to the barracks. That evening, she broke each remaining cookie into pieces and shared them with Greta, Mina, and 3 other women. Each piece was tiny, barely a bite, but they savored them like rare treasures. "An American guard gave these to me," Anneliese said quietly. "He asked for nothing in return." Greta examined her small piece of biscotti. "Perhaps they are not what we were told they were," she said finally. Mina nodded. "Perhaps we were not what we thought we were either." The cookies were gone in minutes, but the gesture lingered much longer. Sergeant Washington had a tradition. Every Sunday, regardless of where he was stationed, he prepared a meal that reminded him of home. Growing up in rural Georgia, Sunday dinner had been sacred in his family. After church, his mother and grandmother would spend the afternoon cooking, and the whole family would gather around a table, groaning with food. Now, thousands of miles from home and cooking for soldiers instead of family, he maintained that tradition as best he could. The first Sunday in March, he decided to extend that tradition to include the German prisoners. Captain Richardson had been encouraging integration, believing that treating the women with dignity would make them more cooperative. Washington saw an opportunity to do something good. He planned a traditional Southern Sunday dinner: fried chicken, cornbread, collard greens, black-eyed peas, and sweet tea. It took him and his kitchen staff most of Saturday to prepare. Sunday afternoon, the prisoners filed into the mess hall expecting their usual meal. Instead, they found tables set with real plates instead of metal trays, cloth napkins, and serving dishes filled with food they had never seen before. The smell alone was overwhelming. Greta stood at the entrance, temporarily paralyzed by confusion. This was not how prisoners were supposed to be treated. This looked like a family gathering, not a detention facility. Sergeant Washington stood at the front of the room, wearing his dress uniform instead of his usual kitchen whites. Captain Richardson stood beside him. "Ladies," the captain said, waiting for Mina to translate, "Sergeant Washington has prepared a traditional American Sunday dinner for us today. This is how many American families eat when they gather together. We wanted to share this with you." The prisoners slowly took their seats, uncertain what was expected of them. The meal was served family style, with large platters and bowls passed around the tables. When the fried chicken reached Greta, she stared at the golden brown pieces glistening with oil. She had not eaten fried chicken since before the war, and even then, it had been a rare luxury. She took one piece carefully, then watched as American soldiers took 2 or 3 without hesitation. The casual abundance still shocked her. Annalise tasted the cornbread and her eyes widened. It was sweet and moist, nothing like the dense, dark bread she had grown up with. The butter melted into it, creating a richness that seemed almost sinful. She ate slowly, trying to make each bite last, trying to memorize the taste because she was certain nothing this good would come again. Mina tried the collard greens and found them surprisingly flavorful, cooked with ham, hock, and seasoned in ways she had never experienced. The black-eyed peas were creamy and satisfying, and the sweet tea was a revelation, cold and sweet and refreshing in a way that made her throat ache with something beyond thirst. Around the room, the prisoners ate in silence, overwhelmed by the experience. April brought the first batch of mail from Germany. The Red Cross had finally established reliable communication channels, and letters began, arriving at Camp Riverside in bundles. Captain Richardson called the prisoners together to distribute them, warning them gently that the news might be difficult. Of the 47 women now housed at the camp, 32 received letters. 15 heard nothing, and the silence felt worse than bad news. Greta's letter came from her aunt in Munich. Her mother and sister had been alive as of February, living in the basement of their bombed-out apartment building. The letter was brief, written in cramped handwriting on thin paper that felt fragile as tissue. "Your mother asks about you constantly. We have not told her you were captured because we feared it would break her heart. Katrine is working in a factory. We eat once a day, sometimes less. There is no meat, no butter, no sugar. Yesterday we made soup from grass and potato peels. Please pray for us." Greta read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She walked to the mess hall, where dinner preparations were underway. The smell of roasting beef filled the air. Sergeant Washington was preparing pot roast with carrots and potatoes, a hearty American dinner. Greta stood in the doorway watching him work, watching him season the meat generously, watching him peel potatoes and discard the thick peels into the waste bin without a second thought. Those potato peels could have made soup for her family. That single roast could have fed her entire apartment building for days. The disparity was so vast that her mind struggled to encompass it. She was a prisoner eating better than free citizens in her own country. The injustice of it felt suffocating, but she could not determine who the injustice was being done to. Annalise's letter brought worse news. Her building in Hamburg had been completely destroyed in a bombing raid in March. Her mother had survived and was living in a displaced persons camp, but her younger brother was missing, presumed dead. "I do not know if this letter will reach you," her mother had written. "I do not know if you are alive. I pray every day that you are safe. wherever you are. We have nothing here. No food, no home, no hope. If you are alive, if you can, please send help." That evening, Annalisa approached Mina with a desperate question. "Can prisoners send packages to Germany?" Mina checked with Captain Richardson, who explained gently that it was not permitted. Prisoners of war could not send supplies to enemy nations, even to their own families. The policy made sense from a military standpoint, but felt unbearably cruel in practice. Annalise returned to her bunk and cried for the first time since her capture. Corporal Rafael Martinez had grown up in El Paso, Texas, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. His mother ran a small grocery store, and he had learned early that food was more than sustenance. It was connection, comfort, and sometimes the only thing standing between despair and hope. When he was assigned to guard duty at Camp Riverside, he brought that philosophy with him. Even though regulations discouraged fraternization with prisoners, he noticed the change in the German women after the letters arrived. They moved through their daily routines mechanically, their faces reflecting a grief that went beyond homesickness. It was guilt, he realized, guilt that they were eating while their families starved. He understood that feeling. His own family had struggled during the Depression, and he remembered the shame of having enough when neighbors had nothing. On his next leave, Martinez went into Harrisburg and spent half his pay at a candy store. He returned to camp with 24 Hershey bars, the standard American chocolate that soldiers carried overseas and gave to children in liberated towns. He knew he was breaking protocol, but some things mattered more than regulations. During evening recreation time, he approached the group of German women sitting outside their barracks. Greta saw him coming and tensed. Guards who approached outside of official duties usually wanted something, but Martinez simply held out a paper bag. "For you ladies," he said, his Spanish accent coloring his English, "to share." He set the bag down and walked away before anyone could refuse. Greta opened it cautiously and gasped. Inside were chocolate bars, more chocolate than she had seen in 5 years combined. She called the other women over. 23 prisoners gathered around as Greta carefully divided the chocolate bars, breaking each one into pieces so everyone could have some. When it was distributed, each woman held approximately 2 squares of chocolate. Such a small amount by American standards, but to them it felt like wealth. Annalisa stared at her portion, remembering the last time she had eaten chocolate. It had been her 19th birthday, 1943, and her mother had traded a week's worth of ration coupons for a small piece of dark chocolate. They had divided it among 3 people, and each bite had been precious. Now, she had more chocolate than that entire birthday portion. She placed 1 square on her tongue and let it melt slowly, the sweetness almost painful after years without sugar. Around her, other women did the same, their eyes closing as they savored something they thought they might never taste again. Some cried quietly, others smiled for the first time in weeks. Mina ate her chocolate and thought about her father, who had loved sweets. She wished desperately that she could have shared this with him. That night, Greta wrote in her notebook, practicing her English. "Today, an American soldier gave us chocolate. He asked for nothing. He simply walked away. I do not understand these people. They feed us. They give us gifts. They treat us like human beings, not enemies. Who does this? What kind of country does this?" May brought warmer weather and a new opportunity. Sergeant Washington needed extra help in the kitchen as the camp population expanded. He requested permission to train some of the prisoners in basic baking skills, arguing that it would reduce his workload while giving the women useful skills for their eventual return to Germany. Captain Richardson approved, and Mina posted a notice in the barracks asking for volunteers. 8 women signed up, including Greta and Annalise. They reported to the kitchen at 5 in the morning, nervous and uncertain what would be expected of them. Washington greeted them with his usual warmth and showed them to a work area where ingredients were laid out: flour, sugar, eggs, butter, milk, yeast. Greta stared at the quantities and felt the familiar shock of American abundance. "Today we make bread," Washington announced, and Mina translated. "Basic white bread, 4 loaves. Pay attention because you will do this yourselves next time." He demonstrated the process, measuring ingredients with casual precision. 5 cups of flour per loaf. The amount made Greta's hands tremble. In Berlin, 5 cups of flour had been a month's ration for her entire family by the war's end. Here, it was used for a single loaf of bread that would be consumed in a day. Washington showed them how to mix the dough, how to knead it until it became smooth and elastic. The physical work felt good after months of limited activity. Annalisa found herself enjoying the rhythm of pushing and folding, watching the dough transform under her hands. It reminded her of helping her grandmother bake before the war, when such activities were normal, rather than luxuries. The most remarkable part came when Washington opened bags of flour to refill the bins. The flour was pure white, fine as powder, nothing like the gray mixture of sawdust, chestnuts, and whatever grain could be found that had been passed off as flour in wartime Germany. Greta reached out and let the flour run through her fingers. "This is real wheat flour?" she asked Mina in German. Mina translated the question. Washington looked puzzled. Of course, what else would it be? The prisoners exchanged glances but said nothing. How could they explain that in Germany, real wheat flour had become so rare that it was reserved only for the highest officials? That ordinary people had been baking bread from substitutes for years? That this single bag of flour represented a level of abundance they had forgotten existed? They could not explain, so they simply continued working, learning to shape loaves and place them in pans. When the bread came out of the ovens, golden brown and fragrant, Washington cut thick slices and spread them with butter. "You made this," he said simply. "You should taste your work." Greta bit into her slice and tasted bread the way it was supposed to taste: soft, light, slightly sweet, and rich with butter. She thought about her mother making soup from potato peels and felt tears burning behind her eyes. The bread was delicious, and that somehow made everything worse. The camp library was a small room with 2 tables, several chairs, and racks holding newspapers and magazines. Captain Richardson had decided that the prisoners should have access to news, believing that understanding what had happened in Germany might help them process their situation. The newspapers were in English, which meant only Mina and a few others could read them initially, but that was enough to start spreading the truth. June 5, 1945. Mina sat alone in the library, working her way through a stack of newspapers from the previous weeks. She had been avoiding the detailed reports about concentration camps, unable to reconcile those stories with the Germany she thought she knew. But today she forced herself to read everything: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The words seemed impossible, the descriptions too horrific to be real, but the photographs did not lie. She read testimony from American soldiers who had liberated the camps, their accounts filled with details that made her stomach turn. She read about the systematic murder of millions, about the infrastructure of death that had been built while she was filing paperwork in Cologne, while Greta was coordinating supplies in Berlin, while Annalisa was sending radio transmissions from Hamburg. They had been part of the machine, even if they had not known what the machine was doing. But alongside these reports of horror, Mina noticed something else. Articles about American agriculture, about harvest yields that seemed impossible, reports of food production statistics that dwarfed anything Germany had achieved even in peacetime. Stories about American civilians being asked to voluntarily ration certain items to support the war effort, not because there was not enough, but to ensure that soldiers and allies overseas had plenty. The contrast was devastating. Greta found her there an hour later, surrounded by newspapers, her face pale. "You have been reading about the camps," Greta said quietly, in German. It was not a question. Mina nodded. "Not just that. Read this." She pushed a newspaper across the table, pointing to an article about American wheat production in 1944. The numbers were staggering. Greta read slowly, her English improving, but still requiring concentration. "This cannot be accurate," Greta said finally. "If America was producing this much food, then Germany never had any chance of winning. Our entire strategy was based on the idea that blockades would starve the Allies into surrender, but they were never hungry at all." Mina met her eyes. "We were the ones starving. We were the ones whose production was failing, and our leaders knew it. They had to know it." Annalisa entered the library and found them sitting in heavy silence. "What is wrong?" she asked. Mina gestured to the newspapers. "Everything we were told was a lie. Not just about the camps, about everything. America was never weak. They were never struggling. They have so much food that they can feed their prisoners better than we fed our soldiers." The three women sat together, processing the magnitude of their country's deception and their own complicity in supporting it. Captain Richardson faced a dilemma. The 4th of July was approaching, and traditionally, military bases celebrated with barbecues and festivities. But how did you celebrate American independence in front of prisoners from a recently defeated enemy nation? She consulted with Sergeant Washington and several other senior staff members. The consensus was surprising. Include them. Show them what American values actually looked like, not through propaganda or military might, but through community and shared celebration. The decision was announced a week in advance. There would be a barbecue on the 4th of July, and all camp personnel, including prisoners, were invited to participate. The prisoners received the news with confusion. Greta assumed it was some kind of test or trick. Why would captors celebrate their national holiday with prisoners? It made no strategic sense. But Mina, who had been reading more about American culture, understood something the others did not. Americans genuinely believed in their ideals about equality and human dignity, even when it was inconvenient. The 4th of July arrived hot and bright. In the camp's recreation area, Sergeant Washington and his staff had set up grills and long tables. The smell of cooking meat began drifting across the compound early in the morning. By noon, hamburgers and hot dogs were sizzling on the grills. Corn on the cob was boiling in massive pots, and watermelons sat in tubs of ice water waiting to be sliced. Greta emerged from her barracks with the other prisoners, drawn by the smells and her own curiosity. She had never seen a hamburger before. In Germany, ground meat had been made into different dishes, but this American creation was new. She watched as soldiers built their burgers, stacking meat, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and condiments between soft white buns. The casualness with which they built these elaborate sandwiches amazed her. Private Martinez appeared beside her, carrying 2 plates. "Try one," he said, handing her a prepared hamburger. Greta accepted it carefully, studying the construction before taking a bite. The flavors exploded in her mouth. The beef was seasoned and grilled perfectly, the cheese melted and creamy, the vegetables fresh and crisp. It was messy and wonderful and completely overwhelming. She had not realized food could taste like this, that a simple sandwich could contain such complexity and satisfaction. Annalisa discovered hot dogs and fell in love. The snappy casing, the soft bun, the strange yellow mustard that was nothing like German mustard, but somehow perfect. She ate too, then felt guilty about her enthusiasm until she saw American soldiers eating 3 or 4 without anyone commenting. The abundance was normal here, excess was expected. Mina tried watermelon for the first time and laughed at the simple joy of cold, sweet fruit juice running down her chin. Around her, prisoners and guards mingled, the boundaries between captor and captive blurring over shared food and summer sunshine. August 10, 1945. Giuseppe Romano had been reading about the German prisoners at Camp Riverside in the local newspaper for weeks. The stories had touched something in him, reminding him of his own family's immigrant experience. His parents had come from Sicily in 1907, arriving at Ellis Island with nothing but hope and determination. They had faced prejudice and suspicion, but America had given them opportunity. Now, at 62 years old, Giuseppe owned the most successful Italian restaurant in Harrisburg. He had been thinking about those German women for days, young, far from home, caught up in a war they probably never fully understood. He knew what it felt like to be viewed with suspicion because of where you came from. During the First World War, his family had faced hostility for being Italian. Now, decades later, he wondered if he could offer these women a small gesture of welcome, the same kind of welcome America had eventually given his family. Giuseppe made his decision on a Tuesday morning. He would bring food to the camp, not just any food, but something special, something that represented the abundance and generosity he believed America stood for. He spent the morning in his kitchen preparing his grandmother's meatball recipe. Ground beef, ground pork, breadcrumbs, eggs, Parmesan cheese, fresh basil, garlic. He formed the meatballs carefully, each one the size of a small fist, then simmered them in his signature marinara sauce for 3 hours. By noon, he had 40 meatball sub sandwiches prepared. Each sandwich contained 4 large meatballs, covered in sauce and melted mozzarella cheese, served on a crusty Italian roll that was nearly 12 inches long. He packed them carefully in wooden crates, keeping them warm, then loaded them into his delivery truck and drove to Camp Riverside. At the gate, he explained his mission to the confused guards, who eventually called Captain Richardson. The captain came to the gate, suspicious but intrigued. Giuseppe explained in his accented English that he wanted to give the prisoners a taste of Italian-American food, to show them that America was a place where immigrants could thrive and contribute. Richardson was moved by the gesture and approved it immediately. Within an hour, the prisoners were called to an unexpected assembly in the mess hall. Greta entered the hall and stopped. On the tables were wooden crates, and the smell coming from them was extraordinary. Rich tomato sauce, garlic, cheese, and something meaty and wonderful. Giuseppe stood at the front with Captain Richardson, looking nervous but determined. Through Mina's translation, he explained who he was and why he had come. "My family came to America with nothing," he said. "This country gave us a chance. I want to give you the same welcome my family received. This is food from my restaurant. I hope you enjoy it." The crates were opened, and the prisoners stared in disbelief. The sandwiches were enormous, each one bigger than any meal they had seen in years. Greta accepted one and held it with both hands, studying its construction. 4 massive meatballs, each one alone, would have been a meal in wartime Germany. The sauce, rich and aromatic. The cheese, melted and indulgent. The bread soft inside with a crispy crust. The whole sandwich must have weighed over a pound. She took a bite and had to close her eyes. The flavors were intense and layered. The meatballs were tender and perfectly seasoned, the sauce sweet and savory simultaneously, the cheese adding richness that seemed almost excessive. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, and that realization broke something inside her. She set the sandwich down and began crying, deep sobs that shook her entire body. Around her, other women were doing the same, overwhelmed by the generosity and the stark reminder of everything they had lost and everything they were discovering about this strange country. That evening, Greta sat on her bunk, unable to sleep. The meatball sandwich had affected her more profoundly than she could explain to the others. It was not just the food itself, though that had been remarkable. It was what the food represented. Giuseppe Romano had spent his own money and his own time to bring food to enemy prisoners. Not because he had to, not because anyone ordered him to, but because he believed it was right. This kind of generosity seemed impossible in the Germany she knew. She thought about her mother and sister in Berlin, eating soup made from grass and potato peels. She thought about the daily rations at Camp Riverside, each meal containing more food than her family saw in a week. She thought about Sergeant Washington teaching them to bake with pure white flour. She thought about Private Martinez sharing chocolate. She thought about Giuseppe's enormous sandwiches given freely to women whose country had just tried to destroy his adopted homeland. The contradiction was unbearable. Germany had sent her to war claiming moral superiority, claiming they were defending civilization, claiming they were the bulwark against chaos. But here, in enemy captivity, she had experienced more genuine human kindness than she had known in years. The Americans fed her, taught her, treated her with dignity, and asked nothing in return. How was this possible? How had everything she believed been so completely wrong? Greta pulled out her notebook and began writing in German, trying to process her thoughts. "I cannot return to Germany," she wrote, "not because I do not love my mother and sister, not because I do not feel guilt about eating while they starve, but because returning would mean leaving behind something precious I have discovered here. These Americans have shown me that the world does not have to be about scarcity and fear. They have shown me that former enemies can become friends, that abundance can be shared, that kindness is not weakness." She paused, her hand trembling. What she was contemplating was unprecedented, possibly impossible, but she had to try. "Tomorrow, I will speak to Captain Richardson. I will ask if there is any way to remain in America, to build a new life here, not as a prisoner, but as someone who has learned what it means to be treated with human dignity. My family will not understand. Germany will view me as a traitor. But I cannot unknow what I now know about the world and about myself." Mina found her still writing hours later. "You are not sleeping," Mina observed in German. Greta looked up, her eyes red. "I am making a decision that will change everything," she said quietly. "I am going to ask to stay in America." Mina sat down slowly. She had been having similar thoughts but had not dared voice them. "I have been thinking the same thing," she admitted. "Is that wrong? Is that betraying our families?" Greta shook her head. "I think returning to Germany and pretending we have not changed would be the real betrayal. We cannot unknow what we have learned here. We cannot pretend that the sandwich Giuseppe brought us was normal, that the way Americans have treated us is ordinary. If we return to Germany carrying these truths, we will always be outsiders. But here, perhaps we can build lives that honor what we have learned." Annalisa appeared in the doorway. She had been listening. "I want to stay too," she said simply. "My mother told me in her letter that I should make a new life if I can. She said I should not come back to nothing." The three women sat together in the quiet barracks, understanding that they were about to attempt something that no German prisoners of war had ever done before. They were going to choose their captors over their country, not out of disloyalty, but out of hope. August 15th, 1945. The day had finally arrived. Captain Richardson stood before the assembled prisoners with documents from the War Department. The formal repatriation process would begin in 2 weeks. Ships were being prepared. Displaced persons camps in Europe were ready to receive them, and procedures were in place to return the women to whatever remained of their homes in Germany. The war was over. It was time for everyone to go home. The captain spoke carefully, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. "I know many of you have received difficult news from Germany. I know that what you are returning to is not the same country you left. The War Department has established support services to help you transition. You will not be abandoned." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "However, if any of you have concerns about your repatriation, my door is open. We are prepared to listen." It was the opening Greta had been waiting for. She stood slowly, her heart pounding. "Captain Richardson, may I speak?" Permission was granted. Greta took a deep breath and switched to English, wanting to make sure there was no misunderstanding. "Captain, some of us have been discussing our situation. We understand that repatriation is required, but we wish to ask if there are other possibilities." The room became completely silent. Every prisoner, every guard, everyone present seemed to stop breathing. Captain Richardson had anticipated this moment. The camp administrators had noticed the changes in the prisoners. the growing attachment to American routines and values, the increasing reluctance to discuss their eventual return to Germany. "What kind of possibilities are you referring to, Fräulein Schroeder?" she asked carefully. Greta straightened her shoulders, gathering courage. "The possibility of remaining in America, not as prisoners but as immigrants, as people who wish to build new lives here." The shock was immediate and widespread. Some prisoners gasped. Guards exchanged confused glances. Captain Richardson remained carefully neutral. "That is a significant request. Do you speak only for yourself?" Greta looked around the room. Mina stood up, then Annalisa, then 12 other women, each one rising slowly to stand in solidarity. 15 women total, nearly 1/3 of the camp's population, declaring their desire to stay with their former enemies rather than return to their homeland. Captain Richardson felt the weight of history in that moment. She was witnessing something unprecedented, something that would require careful handling and communication with her superiors. "Ladies, I understand this request, but you must understand the implications. Legally, you are still classified as prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation. What you are asking for would require special dispensation from the War Department, possibly from the State Department, maybe even from the President himself. This is not a simple matter." Greta nodded, having expected this response. "We understand, Captain, but we must try. We have learned things here that we cannot unlearn. We have experienced kindness that we cannot forget. And we have discovered that home is not just where you were born, but where you choose to build a life that reflects your values. America has shown us values we want to live by." The War Department's response arrived 1 week later. It was characteristically bureaucratic, but surprisingly flexible. Prisoners who wished immediate repatriation would be processed within 2 weeks. Those requesting to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and would be eligible to apply for immigration status. However, they would need sponsors, employment, and housing. The camp could not continue to support them indefinitely. It was an opportunity, but not a guarantee. Captain Richardson called another assembly to announce the decision. Of the 15 women who had requested to stay, 3 decided the uncertainty was too great. They would return to Germany and face whatever they found there. 12 remained committed, including Greta, Mina, and Annalisa. The 35 women choosing repatriation had mixed feelings. Some were relieved to return home. Others felt they were abandoning something precious, but believed duty required them to help rebuild Germany. Sergeant Washington proposed a farewell dinner for those departing. Not a military meal, but something special that would honor both groups and what they had experienced together over the past 6 months. Captain Richardson approved, and Washington began planning the most elaborate meal of his career. He wanted to create something that would symbolize everything that had happened at Camp Riverside, a meal that bridged cultures and represented the transformation that had occurred. The preparation took 3 days. Washington enlisted help from his kitchen staff, from the prisoners who had learned to bake, and even from local restaurants who donated ingredients. The menu was ambitious: roast turkey, baked ham, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole, green beans, corn, fresh rolls, 3 types of pie, and a special request from Greta. She asked if Giuseppe Romano could be invited to bring more of his meatball sandwiches. Washington loved the idea and contacted the restaurant owner personally. August 23, 1945. The mess hall had been transformed. Tables were arranged in a large square so everyone could see each other. White tablecloths covered the surfaces, and simple flower arrangements decorated each table. American soldiers and German prisoners would sit together, a final meal shared as something closer to friends than enemies. As the prisoners entered, they stopped, overwhelmed by the care that had gone into this gesture. Giuseppe Romano arrived with his sandwiches, but this time he stayed for the meal. He wanted to meet the women his food had affected so deeply. Through Mina's translation, He shared stories of his family's immigrant experience, of the struggles and eventual acceptance they had found in America. His presence added another layer of meaning to the evening. He represented what the women choosing to stay hoped to become, immigrants who had found belonging in this strange, generous country. The meal began with Sergeant Washington offering a toast. "To new beginnings," he said simply, "for those returning to Germany to rebuild, and for those staying in America to build something new. May you all find peace and purpose wherever your paths lead." Glasses were raised, some filled with cider, others with water, all clinking together in a moment of genuine unity. The food was served family style, platters passed around tables where guards and prisoners sat side by side. The departure day arrived with mixed emotions. September 1st, 1945. Transport trucks waited outside the camp gates, ready to take 35 women to the port in Philadelphia, where ships bound for Europe were loading displaced persons and repatriated prisoners. The women who were leaving had packed their few belongings, mostly donated clothes and small mementos from their time at Camp Riverside. They gathered in the recreation area for final farewells. Greta stood with her friend Helga, a radio operator from Frankfurt who had decided to return. They had worked together in the kitchen, shared a barracks, and become close over the months. Helga's decision to leave had been difficult, but her parents were still alive and needed her. "I do not judge you for staying," Helga said quietly in German. "I understand why you are doing this, but Germany needs people like us too, people who have learned what we learned here." Greta hugged her friend tightly. "You are right. Germany needs people who can carry these lessons back. You will do good things there. I know it." She pressed a small package into Helga's hands. Inside were letters to her mother and sister, explaining her decision to stay. She could not send them directly, but Helga had promised to deliver them when she reached Germany. The letters had taken Greta 3 days to write, trying to explain the unexplainable to people who had never experienced what she had experienced. Mina said goodbye to several women who had become friends. She gave each one a small German-English dictionary she had created, hoping it might help them in the chaos of occupied Germany, where American soldiers were now the authority. Annalisa stood with her arms around 2 younger women, all 3 of them crying. They had shared a barracks section and had supported each other through the darkest moments of captivity. Now they were choosing different paths forward. Captain Richardson addressed the departing women one final time. Her voice was thick with emotion. "You came here as enemies. You leave as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans are not the monsters you were told we were. And I hope you will carry back to Germany the understanding that former enemies can build peace together." She handed each woman a letter of reference, documenting their good behavior and cooperation during captivity. It might help them navigate the complicated bureaucracy of occupied Germany. The trucks loaded slowly. Women climbed aboard, looking back at the camp that had been their home for 6 months. Some waved. Others simply stared, memorizing details. The trucks pulled away, dust rising behind them, and the women staying behind stood watching until they disappeared from sight. The camp felt emptier suddenly, quieter. 12 German women remained, no longer prisoners, but not yet truly free. They were in limbo, waiting for sponsors, for employment offers, for immigration paperwork to process. The transition was frightening, but also exciting. Within days, offers began arriving. The Henderson family formally requested to sponsor Greta, offering her a room in their home and help finding employment. Dr. Chen, the medical officer, arranged for Annalisa to work as a translator at the local hospital while studying for nursing certification. Mina received an offer from a private school in Harrisburg to teach German language classes. June 12, 1965. Greta Schroeder Henderson stood in her bakery in Philadelphia, surveying the morning's work with satisfaction. The display cases were filled with both German and American baked goods. Dark rye bread sat beside soft white sandwich loaves. Stolen shared space with apple pie. She had named her business Bridge Bakery, representing the connection between her two worlds, the Germany she came from and the America she had chosen. At 44 years old, she had built a life she could never have imagined during those uncertain days at Camp Riverside. She had married Thomas Henderson, the son of the family who had sponsored her. They had 3 children who spoke both English and German, who understood that their mother's story was complicated, but ultimately about hope and transformation. The bakery was successful, respected in the community, a testament to hard work and the possibility of redemption. The bell above the door chimed, and Anneliese Vogel walked in, still wearing her hospital scrubs. She had just finished a night shift as head dietitian at Philadelphia General Hospital. Over 20 years, she had completed her nursing education, worked her way up through hospital administration, and specialized in nutritional therapy. She had never married, dedicating herself instead to healing others as a way of making amends for the past. She and Greta had remained close friends, their bond forged in shared experience that few others could understand. "Coffee?" Greta asked, already pouring. Anneliese nodded gratefully and accepted a slice of fresh apple strudel. They sat at a small table by the window, a weekly ritual they had maintained for years. "Mina called yesterday," Anneliese said. "She wants us to come to her retirement party next month." Mina had become a beloved German teacher at a private school in Harrisburg, inspiring 2 decades of students to appreciate language and culture. Her retirement would be a significant event. "Of course we will go," Greta said. "We 3 have to stay together. We are the ones who remember." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching people pass by on the street outside. The world had changed dramatically in 20 years. Germany had been rebuilt, transformed from a defeated enemy into a democratic ally. The relationship between America and Germany had evolved from occupation to partnership. But for Greta, Anneliese, and Mina, that transformation had begun much earlier, in a prisoner of war camp where kindness had proven more powerful than hatred. A customer entered, a young woman with a slight accent. "Excuse me, do you have any meatball sandwiches?" she asked hopefully. Greta smiled. "No, but I can direct you to Giuseppe's restaurant, 2 blocks down. Tell them Greta sent you." The customer thanked her and left. Anneliese laughed. "You still remember that day?" Greta nodded. "I will never forget it. That sandwich changed my life. It showed me that America was not just a place, but an idea about how people should treat each other. Giuseppe gave that to us, and we have spent 20 years trying to pay that gift forward."